Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Shevuot daf Yud Chet. We're going to spend a lot of time discussing this case that we started with in the Mishnah. Remember, there was a case where it said, Zohi. This is the case that we're talking about in nidda, right, as opposed to the case in the Mikdash, right? They're very similar, both cases. We have a situation where you're in a particular situation, and then an impurity comes upon you, right? Two different ways. Either the woman becomes a nidda while they're engaging in relations, or the person becomes tamei while they're in the mikdash. Okay, just to remind you, in the mikdash. So we said, since it's a korban olav yored, there is no, right, it's not a chata kfu'ah, a set chata, but it's a sliding scale offering. And because of that, it doesn't come into the criteria where there's laws of either an asham taloi, if you're not sure if you did it or not, or a parhilim davar shel tzibor, if they taught, that everybody that, they taught it in the wrong way, and that everybody made a mistake based on a mistaken ruling of the court. Then we got to this, and then in the case of the nidda, though, it would be a situation where if there were a case where the majority of the people went by an erroneous ruling of the rabbis about this, that they would all have to bring the community would have to bring a parliament davar shel tzibor or an asham taloi if you're not sure if you did it or not. Okay, that's the general. Now we got off on a tangent because we said that Abaye and Rava both said that you could be liable to korbanot in this situation. And now we're trying to figure out what is that situation. So we started at the end of yesterday's daf, where Rava said, okay, it said Rava, most people think it's actually Rava, who said what's exactly the case. And we're going to discuss two possibilities, either samuch levesta or not samuch levesta. And we're going to go through four different options because it's going to be each time, is it tamei chacham or is it nama aretz? Is it someone who knows halakha or doesn't know halakha? So what's samuch levesta? Let's talk about some background. According to the rabbis, okay, and we're going to get to the source for this later today in today's daf, a man is supposed to separate from his wife when she's expected to get her period, okay? And this we'll see later. This means for a 12-hour period or for a day or a night, depending on when she's expected. So it's called the onas samuch levesta. It's the time period when she's expected to get her period, and that's based on previous month or a pattern. We're not going to get into all those halakha right now, but they're expected to separate and not have relations. So now the question is the chiyuv korban that we're talking about specifically when they have relations then? Now, I want to remind you, whoever has relations with this woman when it's samuch levesta goes against a rabbinic ordination, okay, but you don't, like the rabbis said this is forbidden. The Torah didn't say it's forbidden. Torah says it's forbidden to sleep with a woman when she is menstruating, not when she's expecting to be menstruating. So if you go against this rabbinic decree, you're not going to have to bring a sacrifice. Sacrifice is only for Torah law. So now we're going to try out either it's samuch levesta, it's when the rabbis had said don't engage in relations and they did anyway, or it's not samuch levesta and she wasn't even expected to get her period at all. So let's see. So we started yesterday. Let's just start there again. 4 lines from the bottom of Yud Zayin. Ilema. So again, we have to find two sacrifices here, two obligations for a sacrifice. One on the fact that he engaged in relations with her, and one on the fact that he got out of relations in the middle, right, before waiting for him not to be erect. So, bima. If you're going to say it's samuch levesta, it was the time when he wasn't supposed to engage in relations with her anyway. But again, only the rabbis forbade that. Ubima. And then who? Well, ilema tamei chacham. Let's try option 1A. Samuch levesta and tamei chacham. Bishlama knisa lechayev. We understand why we can obligate him a sacrifice on going in and engaging in relations. Kasavar yacholni livo. Now, what we have to find, and let's go back to things we learned in Galut. Right? We talked about Ir Miklat, a refuge city. When do you go to refuge city? When you're smack in the middle, shogeg, okay? But if you're karov lemezid or karov laones, then no. And we're going to do the same kind of thing here. We have to find a case of shogeg. If it's ones and it was totally beyond your control, you don't have to bring a korban. If it was mazid and you didn't intentionally, a korban is not for that. A korban is only for unintentional, right? Then you would get karet if you were intentional. So that's what we're going to struggle to find here. So now if you say, we're talking about a tamei chacham who had relations with his wife when she was expected to get her period, but she didn't yet have her period, that we could call shgaga, and we can obligate a korban. Why? Because he thought yachoni livo, I could get away with it, right? In other words, he went around and it's a rabbinic decree, but right, a rabbinic prohibition. But you're not going to get a korban for that, right? So therefore, what we're going to say is like this: you were shogeg because you should have expected that she might get her period, And therefore, but you thought, you mistakenly thought I could do this before. So that could work. Ella, aprisham alachayev, mezidhu. But when it comes to the prisha, he's a Tamid Chacham, he knows the halakha, and he knows he's supposed to be lifrosh, when to go withdraw, when he's no longer erect, and he did it when he was erect. So that is called mezi. That's intentional. No sacrifice for that. So we can't find two sacrifices. Keep going, top of our daf. Now, Iba Ama'aretz, so now 1b. It's Samach Levesta, and it's an Ama'aretz. Now, an Ama'aretz doesn't really know the halakha. So now, the beginning, we said it could be shogeg because maybe he should have thought she would get her period, but he didn't know, and that's shogeg. Or maybe he didn't even know that there was an issue at all here. But what about the prisha? So obviously on the prisha, he doesn't know either, right? So that might be two korbanot. But no, the Gemara says, if you eat a kazayit of chalev, and then you eat another kazayit of chalev, and then you find out, chalev is usher. That's all considered one forgetting, one not knowing, and you only bring one sacrifice. So here also, he did two things with this woman that he shouldn't have done with his wife, right? That he didn't realize. And it's all one mess up, basically. So for him, it's all one and the same thing, and there should only be one korban. So that doesn't work. So now we're going to move to 2. This is 1a and b. Now we're moving to 2. It must be it's not, she got a period when she wasn't expecting. Okay, it's not the time when she's expected to be menstruating. Ubiman. Now, let's go through our two options. Now we have 2a and 2b. Okay, if it's Tamid Chacham, you shouldn't be obligated anything. Why? Aknisa anus, okay, for having relations with her, it's totally beyond his control. He wasn't expected to have considered, oh, maybe, right? You can't worry every day of the month. Maybe my wife will start menstruating. Aprisha mezid, but once he finds out and she says, while they're in the middle of relations, oh, it's meiti, I started menstruating, well, then he leaves be'ever chai, right, while being erect, he's mezid. He knows the halakha, so that can't be. Iba Ama'aretz, we're up to our last option. If it's an Ama'aretz, again, we're going to say, well, Chaduhu de Mechayev, Aprisha. He's not going to be obligated for entering the wife because Knisa, there's no Isur. We just said he wasn't supposed to, right? The Tamid Chacham certainly is honest. He's also honest. He had no idea she was going to start menstruating. And on the Prisha, you could say he's Chayav, okay, because he didn't know, and that's shogeg. Okay, he didn't know it was us. So that's also only one. So we're stuck. We don't have any explanation. Hadran Rava, so Rava goes back and explains. I'll tell you what the case is where you're chayav 2 korbanot. Lo'olam b'samach levista. We're going to go back to option 1a. It was when she was expected to be menstruating. U'b'tamid chacham, and it's a tamid chacham. Now, what was the problem? We said, wait, tamid chacham, knisa, okay, that's shogeg, because he should have known better, but thought I could get away with it, and maybe she won't start menstruating. So that's shogeg. What about the withdrawal? The withdrawal, we said, is a problem because you should know the halakha. So what are we going to come up with? A situation where he didn't know the halakha. We're going to say, Tamid Chacham lezo ve'ein Tamid Chacham lezo. He knows he's not supposed to be with his wife when it's the expected time, and that he should have anticipated that perhaps this would happen, and that's why he's shogeg. But he didn't know this halakha, that if she ends up in the middle of relations, starting to menstruate, then he has to leave, withdraw when he's no longer erect. Now, it's kind of funny to say, oh, he knew this, didn't know that, right? But it's actually not, because it's much more common that a man's supposed to know when his wife is menstruating, they shouldn't engage in relations. Women also should know, right? They should both know this halakha. That's more expected and typical. It's kind of atypical that while they're in the middle of relations, the woman says, oh, I started menstruating. It's quite rare for that to happen. And therefore, it makes sense maybe he wouldn't know such a rare halakha, right? In general, our knowledge of halakha, even Talmidei Chachamim, are sometimes just the things that come up much more often. And therefore, we found a situation where the Talmid Chacham doesn't know that second halakha, and because of that is shogeg, and therefore we end up with shogeg. Okay, in both cases, 2 korbanot. So Rava has now proven the 2 korbanot. Now Rava wants to tell you, Amarava utravayu taninu. Second sugya for today. So the first was to figure out what are these 2 sacrifices. Now Rava is going to show you, I'm going to show you the obligation for each of these sacrifices in a Mishnah. Okay, he wants to support what he's saying. There's sometimes two sacrifices. And now we're going to show there's two sacrifices. Each of these sacrifices is mentioned in a different Mishnah. Both were learned in a Mishnah. Knisat tanina, prishat tanina. We have one Mishnah that talks about if a man engages in a relationship with his wife and she ends up starting to menstruate, he is obligated korban for the knisa. And there's another one that says obligated the korban for the withdrawal if he withdraws when he's still erect. Prisha tanina. So now we're going to see where each of these mishnayot. Well, prisha is our mishnah. That's it, right? We learned this. Dekatane. Hayam shamesh mateora. Va'amar lo nitmeti. Uperesh miyad. Hayav. If he leaves immediately, he's obligated. That's because he's still erect. So we're going to say that's okay. Prisha, check. Now we want to find knisa. This one's going to be a little more complicated. Knisa tanina. And I say complicated because he's going to basically prove it from a Mishnah. Rav Ada is going to come and say, that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. The Mishnah is actually talking about prisha, the withdrawal, and not the knisa. So, and then we're going to have an argument back and forth between them. What's the topic of this Mishnah? Dikatani. Here's the Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in nidda daf yudalid. Hayam meshamesh ima teora. We have a man engaging in relations with a woman who is pure. She's not menstruating. Va'ara lo nitmeti. And then, oh, sorry, I just looked at the wrong thing. Knisa tanina. Sorry about that. Skip down. I went to a line before. Knisa tanina. Nimtza al shelo tmeim v'chayavim bekorban. We're talking about a couple who engage in relations, and after having relations, the man takes a cloth, cleans himself off, and finds blood on what they call it an aid. Okay, it's an abidika. It's just a cloth he uses, but it shows it's like an aid. It's like a witness to the fact that there's blood there. Now, if he doesn't have any sort of cut or laceration where the blood could come from, we assume the blood came from his wife. Now, when would the blood have come from his wife? Obviously, when they were engaged in relations. This is a sign that she must have been menstruating when they engaged in relations. So if he finds al shelo on his cloth, we're going to see what if she finds on her cloth. We'll talk about that later. Tmeim v'chayavim bekorban. They're both tmeim. Okay, she's tmeat nidda, and a man who sleeps with his wife when she's a nidda, okay, ends up becoming tamei 7 days, just like she is. So he's tamei also. And chayavim bekorban, and they're obligated to korban because they accidentally, engaged in relations when she was a nidda. That's shogeg. Now, what do we see here? We're assuming my lav is this not our case. Bisamach levesta, where she was anticipating menstruating, and a knisa. And why would he be obligated to korban? Because, and as we have to come up with a case where it's shogeg and not anus, so we have to assume it was samuch levesta and obligated on knisa. In other words, what's the korban for, if not for the fact that he engaged in relations with this woman when it was samuch levesta? He should have anticipated. He didn't. We call that shogeg. And then it proves, here's a Mishnah that says there's a korban for knisa also, not just for prisha, which is very obvious from our Mishnah, but this one gives the second one, and that goes back to where we started today. Both Abaye and Rava say there's a korban for knisa and a korban for prisha. But Amalei Rav Ada bar Matna Rava, he says, who's to say that's what this Mishnah is talking about? Maybe Lo'olam Malacha b'shalosh samuch levista. Maybe it's when it's not the time she was expected to menstruate, in which case there's no korban for the knisa because that's what we call ones, completely unexpected. So what's the obligation then? A prisha. He's liable on the prisha, right? He's going to have to bring the korban because he withdrew from the woman while he was still erect. Question number one, we're going to see there's a few questions, or two questions. Question number one is, why do we need a Mishnah to tell us exactly what our Mishnah tells us, right? Then we have two Mishnayot telling us the exact same thing. There's never really a reason for that. So that's the Gemara's first question. If you want to say, Prisha Lamali, this Rav Ada, by the way, raises a question on what he says and is going to resolve it. If you want to say Prisha Lamali, Hatanale had already learned about Prisha in our Mishnah. Why was this brought? It was brought to teach us the following thing. Really, it didn't need to bring us that case, but it wanted to bring us that case to foil it with the other case. I told you we were going to get to what if she finds when she's cleaning herself after. Nimtza al shela tmeim safek ukturim min korban. If she finds on her cloth after she's cleaning herself Tmeim b'safek. They become impure as a doubtful situation. We're not sure. Because why? Well, if she finds it, it could be that she was bleeding at the time of the act of engaging in relations. Could be it happened after, right? Because she's checking, let's say, 2 minutes later. Maybe right then she got it, in which case they didn't actually do anything wrong. Maybe her period started right now, right? Remember, if it's on him, had to come from her body, if not while they were engaging in relations. If it's on her, could have happened later. And ptulim in korban, and they're exempt from the sacrifice. And since they wanted to get to the case of her finding it, they foiled it with the case of him. And therefore, the case of him really isn't necessary. We could have learned that from our Mishnah. And it could be talking about Prisha. And it could be talking about when it was not the time of her Besed, and that's why the Korban is not on the Knisa, on the Prisha. And that goes against Rava, who was the whole time trying to say, that Mishnah, right? I have a Mishnah for Prisha, that's ours. I have a Mishnah for Knisa, that's this. And comes Ravada and says, not necessarily. But Amalei Ravina le Ravada comes in Ravina. Okay, so we have Rava and Ravada arguing. Ravina comes in and he says, listen, how on earth, okay, here's question number 2 on Ravada, right? Ravada already kind of dealt with question 1 and said, don't say this is unnecessary because I can tell you why it's necessary. It's not necessary for that line, it's necessary for the next line, and they brought it as a foil. But comes Ravina and he has a really good question. He says, how could you possibly say that case is a case of, right? Okay, whether samuch levastav or not, that's not really the critical part, but it wasn't the time of Farber, which means it wasn't talking about the Knisa. But because you're certainly not obligated korban on that, you're totally onus. It's totally beyond your control to have thought, oh, maybe the woman's going to start menstruating right then. But the problem is the prisha. Now remember, what's the case of prisha? While they're engaging in relations, the woman says, nitmeti. He's supposed to then say, oh, wait, I have to wait till I'm no longer erect and only leave then. And if he doesn't, he's chayav a korban. But that's not the case here. It's obviously not the case, because what was the case? The case was, Vahat nimtza katani. When did he figure out that she was in nidda? After the fact, right? It says, if he finds blood while he's cleaning himself after. So that means he didn't find out during, and then of course you can't obligate him if he left when he was still erect, right? It's not the situation here, and likely he didn't withdraw when he was erect because he didn't even know she was in nidda, right? Nimtza katane, b'nimtza lebatar hachi mashma. Nimtza sounds like he only found out after. That's clearly not the situation. How did Rabbanit even think to suggest this was the situation? The a prisha, right? If it's prisha, then meikara ki parishle, right? Meikara havile idea. If it was prisha, then he would have known about it already before, and he would have, right? Meikara, when he withdrew from her, he already knew, and that's clearly not the situation. So Amarle Rava, after hearing what Rabbanit says to Rav Ada, Said my dekama Rabach. Go listen to what your rabbi taught, meaning Ada's rabbi was Ravina. And basically Rav is saying, I claimed my claim. Okay, I didn't have the best proof, but he's got a really good proof. Listen to Ravina. Amarle, but Rav Ada comes back with a retort. Rav Ada, even though this is an excellent question, it really makes it very difficult to say this is talking about Prisha, because it really does sound like he only found out after, which is obviously not the case of withdrawing when he was erect, because he knew that, right, he had to leave quickly. But Amarle, Hechi Atzit, how can I accept Rabina's interpretation? Ditanya. It says, and now he's going to raise a different problem, an external problem. Okay, he's not really answering the question, the difficulty, but he's saying, look at this braita. There's a braita on that Mishnah. Oftentimes we have braita that define Mishnayot or add something to Mishnayot. There's a braita, Tanya Allah, means there's a braita on that. Zohi mitzvat aseh shebinida shechayavin aleha. This is a mitzvat aseh in nidda that you're going to be obligated, right? Again, you'll be obligated korban chatat kfu'ah, right? Which is going to mean then perhaps you could get to a helim daber shel tzibor if that were the situation, or an asham talo if you're not sure. Okay, this is the example of a mitzvah aseh b'nidda. Now, if you're going to say what you want to say, Rava, that this is all about the knisa, about a woman who's expected to get to be menstruating. The husband has relations with her anyway, thinking I could get away with this, right? Is that a mitzvah aseh, a positive commandment? Of course not. It's a negative commandment. If you're right, it should be mitzvah lo tasehi. What's the mitzvah lo taseh? Don't engage in relations with your wife when she's in nidda, right? That's a lo taseh. There's no mitzvah aseh involved there. Now, what we're going to see later is the Gemara is going to tell us on Abaye what the mitzvah aseh is. We're going to see that if a man engages in relations when his wife is in nidda, and she becomes nidda while they're engaging in relations, where there's a positive commandment to withdraw when he's not erect, and there's a negative commandment to withdraw when he is erect, meaning it's forbidden to withdraw when erect, and it's a positive commandment to withdraw when he's not erect. So it comes from Abaye and Rava and says it's clearly about prisha because it mentions the mitzvah aseh, and there's only a mitzvah aseh in prisha and not in the knisa. Knisa for sure, engaging in relations with a woman when she's in nidda is clearly don't do that. There's no positive commandment associated with it all. So he says the wording on this braita seems to prove my point about my reading of the Mishnah that's talking about prisha, not knisa. To which Rava says, Amarle, itanita, if you want to accept this braita, it's kind of like Rava saying, I don't even know about this braita, but let's say you want to keep this braita. Amend the braita. It's obviously a mistake, okay? It's missing words, and this is how it should be read. Zohi mitzvah lo ta'aseh shebenidash chayavin aleh. Okay, this is a negative commandment that you're obligated. And okay, you want to say it mentions positive. I'm not going to erase that completely. But then I'll say, and from there they segue into the case of prisha. It wasn't the case of the Mishnah, but the Braita says, oh, the Mishnah, that was a negative. That was don't engage in relations with your wife when she's in nidda. And even, right, in other words, you're going to be obligated to korban if you engage in relations with her when she got her period in the middle. You have to bring a korban on that because that was shogeg. And obviously when it's the time she was expecting, otherwise it's onus. But also hayam mishamesh ma'torah. Now, if you want to take this to the later part of that case, if they were engaging in relations and in the middle amar lo nitmeti uperesh miyad chayav, right, and then right he withdraws immediately. Zohi mitzvat aseh shebenidah. That's the mitzvat aseh in nidda. Okay, again, we don't really know what the mitzvah aseh is yet. We're going to see it later in the daf, but that's how he reads it, okay? And that's how Rava resolves it. And again, we started, I'll just go through the two things we did so far in the daf. It's a bit of a complicated daf. See later the daf gets a little easier, but the first part is quite complicated. We started with, you get, both Rava and Abaye said, you're obligated to sacrifice, or potentially you could be. We explained it in case of Samach Levesta and with the Talmid Chacham, who knows the first halakha doesn't know, the second halakha doesn't know he has to leave when he's no longer erect. Then we have the Rava said, I can prove both those korbanot from Mishnayot. One our Mishnah, one this Mishnah nidda. Rav Ada engaged in a debate with him. Is that Mishnah nidda really referring to this case, or is it really referring to prisha and not to knisa? Okay, that's what we did right now. And then we saw the back and forth and why, how Rava supports his position and how Rav Ada tries to support his own position. Short aside, Amar Piresh Miyad Chayav. So you're supposed to, right? If you're Piresh Miyad, you're obligated. On the other hand, we don't want you to remain, right? We don't want the man and wife to remain together while she's in nidda. So what do? Hechi Avid, practically speaking, Amar Rav Huna Mishmei de Rava. Huna says in the name of Rava, no etz eser itziporna bakarka ad shiamut vituve. So the man should put his 10 fingers, like kind of, what's the word? Like push them very strongly into the ground. That will help end the erection. And from there, he will come out as quickly as possible and tuve, and that will be good. Okay? That's what one should do. One should try to get out of this situation as quickly as possible without doing something forbidden, which is leaving when erect. Now, Rava says, now we're going to have another machloket, this time Abaye and Rava. Until now, they were agreeing. Now they're going to have a debate. And the question is, what is the problem with the situation? Okay? Actually, the question is really, why, when he withdraws, if he's no longer erect, is he not obligated to korban? And we're going to see two different reasons. Okay? Rava is going to, before he even says his own reason, really, he's going to reject the other possible reason that Abaye is actually going to adopt. Amar Rava, Zot Omer. Okay, the fact that we have this idea that the man leaves when not erect and will be exempt from a korban in that case teaches us it has ramifications for some other case entirely. Hamishamesh meit ba'arayot patur. If a man engages in relations when not erect at all, with a forbidden relative, like a man and his mother, let's say, if he doesn't have an erection the whole time they're engaging in relations, that's not, he's exempt. That's not considered being transgressing the prohibition of forbidden relations. Just not an act of sex at all. Now, why? Well, de'isa kadatav chayav, if you think he's obligated, then why in our case, when the man withdraws when he's not erect, is he exempt? Now, you might say, Mishum da anusu, you want to say because he wasn't right now. In the case of our situation, it's called anus. He had no way of knowing. Maybe that's why, right? He didn't know she was going to be a nidda and he's got to get out somehow, right? So maybe that's his only option. Well, anusu, ki perish miya namin yiptar. Anusu. If you're going to go with the explanation that it was beyond his control, again, he had no idea she was going to get a period. And therefore, when he went in, he didn't know. Now he has to leave. So, right, the best way to leave, take the best option, the worst of two evils, right? Better to leave when not erect. It'll be less pleasure. And it's all anus. Well, then, even if he leaves when erect, it's anus, right? The whole situation is beyond his control. So he should be not obligated to sacrifice then either. And therefore, Rava says it must be, he doesn't spell this out, but he said it already in the beginning, that if Mishamesh ba'arayot is patur, what he's trying to say is the reason why the person is exempt here when he withdraws, when he's not erect, is because that's just not considered an act of sexual relations if the man is not erect. And that's why he says the ramifications are a man could engage in relations with a woman who is forbidden to by Torah law, but it's not forbidden if he never is erect. Abaye says, no. What are you talking about? A man has relations with somebody who's not erect. What's the difference? That's still considered intercourse. And therefore, what's the reason he's patur? Exactly the reason Rava rejected. Mishum de anusu. Because he's got to get out somehow. It wasn't his fault he got into this situation. He has to come out. Okay, so come out when you're not erect, and we won't obligate you a korban. It's not your fault. Now, you might say, well, then why were you chayav for why are you obligated if he leaves, withdraws when he's still erect? It's a matter of, right, the lesser of two evils. So now I want to really summarize this, because what Rav is saying is, withdrawing when erect is a ma'aseh avera. That is a forbidden action. Withdrawing when not erect is not a forbidden action at all. According to Abaye, they're both kind of forbidden. Just one is the lesser of two evils. Okay? And therefore, if you're mishamesh ba'arayot, right, it's still an act of sexual relations, and therefore you'd be obligated. According to Rava, it's not an action at all. Okay? That's the big difference. Very interesting machlok. Might be a little graphic to get into all these details, but it is an interesting machlok. Amalei Rava bar Chanan la'Abaye. In ken, now here comes a difficulty with Abaye, a very interesting difficulty. In ken matzinu aruka uktsara b'nidda. Remember the aruka uktsara? Now we're going back to our comparison. Our comparison in the Mishnah was a case of someone who becomes impure in the temple, and they have two ways out. One is long, one is short. And what do they have to do? They have to take the shortest way out. If they take the long way, they're going to be obligated korban. The short way, they're going to be not obligated korban. Well, then you have the exact same thing here. In a minute, we'll see why that's a difficulty. But we have a man who engages in a relationship with his wife. She becomes impure while he's inside. He needs to get a way out, right? It's just like in the temple. You're stuck in a situation. You've got to get out. So there's a quick way and there's a long way. Now here you're going to see it's the opposite, okay? The quick way is going to have to bring a korban. The long way, which is wait till he's no longer erect, you actually don't have to bring a korban. So if there's this same concept of katsarana, there's two ways out. One is better, one is worse, right? In other words, also in the mikdash, one is either which way it's bad. You're in the temple when you're pure, when you're impure, right? It's bad. You're inside. You have to get out some way. Let's just take the lesser of two evils. Then there should be this distinction of katsarana ruka and ana b'mikdash tan. Turning out amubet, we only had this case of Tzara and aruka in the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah made a whole comparison between these two cases, but didn't make the comparison and say, oh, it's the same tzara and aruka. It only said there's tzara and aruka in the temple and not here. So that supports Rava that one action is forbidden, one is completely not forbidden. It's not like one is longer, one is shorter, and better take this one than that one, the lesser of two evils. No, one is forbidden, one is not forbidden. One is not even called an act of sexual relation. So, Ela mishum de lo dami. Abaye answers no. It's because the tzara and aruka are not the same. Aruka dahacha, tzara dahata. Aruka dahatam, tzara dahacha, right? In the mikdash, short is good. In sexual relations, short is bad. And opposite, right? Long is good and long is bad in each one. So that's why the Mishnah didn't compare, because it was going to be kind of confusing. You were going to end up with the opposite conclusion. But now we have another problem with Abaye. Alma, did he really say it's anus? Now we have a problem. If Abaye said it's all because it's anus, right? It wasn't the man's fault, which means it wasn't samuch levestan, right? But Alma b'shalo samuch levestan kamrina. V'ha Abaye amar chayav shtayim. Alma b'samuch levestas kinan. But wait, Abaye already explained you get two korbanot chatat for this. If he's explaining this case now about that the person was anus, it wasn't their fault, then it must be it was a case of lo samuch levestan. And before he explained it as if it was samuch levestan and there were two korbanot. So they say, ki itmar da'abai ba'alma itmar. There's the Mishnah and there's Abaye. In other words, these are two different cases. One is the Mishnah and one is the two korbanot. These are not necessarily, the two korbanot is there could be a situation in this way where there are two korbanot, but it's not necessarily that's the case the Mishnah was talking about. Okay? So when he said shtayim, he was just saying there could be a situation. But this case we're talking about is the Mishnah's case. So basically, we're saying it doesn't, Abaye didn't mean every case there's two and that's what we're talking about. He just said there could be a case where there's two, but it wasn't like he was trying to say that's what the Mishnah is talking about. Okay, that was the more complicated part of the daf. Now, so the third thing we did in the daf, I already reviewed the first two, is this machloket Abaye and Rava about why you get why you don't have a korban for peresh after the iver is made, right? When it's no longer erect. Why is there no korban? Is it because it's not an act at all of sexual relations to either go in or go out with not being erect? Or is it because it's just the lesser of two evils? And anus, we would say, right? It wasn't the person's fault. Now we get to what we mentioned about this mitzvah aseh, mitzvah lo taseh. Where are the warnings for all these things? Where do we see in the Torah any of the things we've discussed? Rabbi Natan ben Yosef ben Lakunya, Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya. Okay, one brother asked his other brother, Rabbi Yonatan is the brother of Rabbi Shimon here, and he asked Rabbi Shimon the following question. Where do we know that if a man engages in relations with his wife when she's in nidda? This sounds like a general question. It's forbidden for a man to engage in relations with his wife when she's in nidda in the Torah. Well, like brothers like to do, shakal kala patikbe. He picked up a clod of dirt, threw it at his brother, and said, "You idiot. What you're asking, where's the source for a boel nidda in the Torah? It says it explicitly in the Torah. You don't ask questions about things that are quite obvious. Everybody knows that. Ella, so the brother says, no. What I meant was, he's asking about our case, about the prisha, the withdrawal. How do we know, right? We mentioned before that it's a mitzvah aseh, right? To leave when not erect, okay? If he finds out she's in nidda in the middle. So what's the source for that? For that, now we're going to bring a source. Amar Chizkiah, Amar Kra. Vatihi nidata alav. This is a strange pasuk, the way they're going to darshan it. The pasuk says, Im shachov yishkav ish ota. If a man sleeps with his wife when she's in nidda, vatihi nidata alav. Her nidda goes upon him, which means tamei shivat yamin. Okay, he becomes impure also 7 days. It's kind of like the nidda transfers onto him. Okay, that's the simple reading of the pasuk. What's the drasha here? Tihini data alav sounds like they're saying he could be with her when she's in nidda. When is that? It's a mitzvah aseh that if he's engaged in relations with her, she finds out she's in nidda, he should stay inside until he's no longer erect. That's the mitzvah aseh. Okay, afilu b'shat nidata tehei alav. Even when she's in nidda, she could be with him. Okay. Eshkachan ase lo tasaminalan. So how do we know? Okay, we got now, there's a positive commandment, which is stay inside until you're no longer erect. But what about lo tase? Where do we see it's a negative commandment to leave, to withdraw when he's still erect? Amar Papa, Amar Krav, lo tikrav. Okay, because it says there lo tikrav, right? Elishab, that's the first pasuk we quoted. Elishab nidda tumata lo tikrav. Now, lo tikrav means don't get close to. But now they're going to say something strange. Lo tikrav nami lo tifroshu. Lo tikrav, which means don't get close, also is sometimes understood as don't separate. Okay, meaning, right? Don't separate from her when you're still erect. Dichtiv, how do we know that lo tikrav could be lo tifrosh? As it says in this pasuk about Yeshayahu, ha'omrim krav elecha al tigash bi ki kidashticha. Okay, these people who said stay separate. Okay, krav means come close, but it's not what they said. Okay, Rashi explains these were the Leitzanim of the generation that said, "Oh, you're the Navi, you're pure, we're impure, stay away from us." Krav means get close to yourself. Close to yourself means separate yourself from other people. And that's how they understand get close, meaning get close to yourself, but be distant from other people. And they proved from this pasuk in Yeshayahu. And therefore they said lo tikrav is a reference to lo tifrosh, right? Like don't separate from her while you're still erect. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to this this rabbinic decree of separating, of making sure not to engage in relations with your wife when she's expected to get her period. The hizartem epinei Yisrael mitumatam. Now, hizartem is from the language of zar, a stranger. You should estrange yourself from tuma, okay, from impurity. So what's the drasha here? Notice again, this is rabbinic, so it's not really what the pasuk means. It's the rabbis coming and saying there's a reference to this rabbinic ordination that we instituted. Amar Rabbi Yoshia mikan asara lebnei Yisrael sheyifreshu minashotehen samuch levestan. So when the women are supposed to anticipate menstruating, the men should separate from them, not engage in relations. Vikama, how long do they need to? Right? Let's say a woman supposed to menstruate on a particular date and doesn't. What, he has to separate her for till she menstruates? No. I'm a Rabba, Ona. Rabba says it's one period of either day or night. Okay, and this all depends, without going into all the halakhas, about what happened last month, or if there's some sort of established chazaka of when a woman's anticipating getting it, and then we go by that day, and that's when they need to separate, either during a 12-hour period of day or a 12-hour period of night. Again, 12 hours is shot's money out, relative hours, sunrise to sunset or sunset to sunrise, depending on the previous and what the history. Did she get her last menstruate? Did she start menstruating last time during the day? Was it at night? And again, there's all these patterns. You could come up with different patterns. Okay, without getting into all those halachic details now. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Okay, now before we even read this, I'm just going to preface this whole next section by saying we now get into things that we've seen many times where the rabbis start to say this is an important halakha, and the way they like to do that is, if you don't do this, you will have serious ramifications, right? God will punish you in this way, right? Which nobody really knows how God's going to punish anybody, but they say it to scare people or to encourage people to say, if you do this, great things are going to happen. And they usually often use a lot of the same great things, like you'll have male children, right? Especially if we're talking about sexual relations, right? In that context, it's going to have effects on your children for better or for worse. So we're going to start with the negative, and then we'll move to the positive. Rabbi Yochanan says, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Kol she'eino poresh mishto samuch levesta. If he doesn't do this rabbinic ordination of separating from his wife when it's the time, right? This is the way they strengthened rabbinic ordinations. They said, Afilu havi lo banim ki b'nei Aaron, even if you have like sons who are amazing, like sons of Aaron, metim, they will die. Dichtiv, how do we get this? And now we're going to darshan smichut parshiot, okay, which are psukim that are next to each other. Dichtiv, vizarta b'nei Yisrael mitumatam, right? That's what we learned. Separate, keep yourself estranged from tuma. And it says hadava b'nidata, and the woman when she's in nidda is impure. V'samachle, and the pasuk after hadava b'nidata is acharei mot shnei b'nei Aaron, after the death of Aaron's sons. So we say, someone who sleeps with the woman when she's expected to menstruate is going to have children who die. That's quite harsh. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan. You have to just not take this super literally, right? They're trying to just encourage people in a bit of a negative way. I just assume that was, a common way of speaking in those days. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol poresh mishto samuch levesta. If you actually keep this halakha, havi lo banim zcharim, you will give birth to male children. Dichtiv lavdil ben atamei u ben atahor. Okay, now this is to distinguish between tamei and tahor. It's actually talking about kashrut, but tamei and tahor is also right. Keep different when it's tamei, when it's tahor, right? When she's expecting to become tamei, separate. The next pasuk is Yishaki Tizriya v'yadas achal. And then it says a woman gives birth, right, when she gives birth to a male child. So, smichu parshi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omer, Havi lo banim ru'uyim lahora'ah. He quotes a different pasuk. Now, here you have to do like a three connection. You have the pasuk of Lavdil ben Atamei ben Atahol, and then, right, which connected with the sons being born. But then we have a different pasuk in a different chapter. Okay, this is in chapter 10 about the Kohanim. It says, Ulavdil ben HaKodesh uben HaChol. This is why they should drink in the temple and all that. They have to distinguish between Kodesh and Chol, uben HaTamei, uben HaTahor. So it has the same Tamei Tahor is there. And this pasuk then says, the next pasuk, Ula Horodik b'nei Israel, and to teach the Jewish people to say, you're going to have children who can be teachers. Okay, so if he says, if you do this, you'll have banim ru'uyim lahora'ah, because it says lavdil, and lahorot, and to teach. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, kolam avdil yayin b'motzei Shabbatot. We're now jumping to a different topic. If you do Havdalah, because look at the pasuk, it's talking about lavdil bein kodesh lechol, which sounds like Havdalah. Okay, by the way, there's a big machloket. Is Havdalah a do'oraita? Is it a Torah law or not to do Havdalah? And right, some people use this as their proof. Kolam avdil ala yain. If you use wine for Havdalah and not something else, right? Wine is considered more ideal. On Motzei Shabbat, havilo banim schalim. You will have male children again because it says lavdil ben hakodesh uben hachol. Uchtiv hatam. Again, we make this jump. Kodesh l'chol in the pasuk about the Kohanim, which we say is talking about Havdalah, which again, simple reading is it's not. Lavdil ben atamei uben hator. So it has the same language as in the other pasuk, and that pasuk was right next to the one about Ishaki Tizriya v'yaldas achal. Samach le Ishaki Tizriya. Rabbi Shua ben Levi Omer, banim maruyim lahora'ah. You do wine on Motzei Shabbat, you'll have banim who could teach, because in that same pasuk it said, right, the next pasuk said, dichtiv lahavdil, that was pasuk 1, and then lahorot was the next pasuk, to teach. Amar Rabbi Binyamin ben Yefet, Amar Rabbi Elazar, kol ha'mekadesh et atzmo b'shat tashmish. Here's a different thing. You keep laws of tzniut, okay? You do somehow, it's unclear always how to do this, but there's this concept of keeping laws of modesty somehow within the act of sexual relations. Also, it's something you're going to have be zochet, have male children. Because also, it says you will be sanctified and you will be right. If you sanctify yourselves, you will be sanctified, and then it says, and then you will have male children. Okay, so again, smichu parshio, that teaches you all these things. If you do this, good things will happen to you. Okay, we're going to end with a different machloket. We're now back on a totally different topic. We're back to the Mishnah. There was something in the Mishnah that wasn't very clear. We're going to have to try to understand it, which is that with this machloket, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, and third opinion, but right now we're going to deal with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, about the pasuk. If you remember, it says, O nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tamei, right? If you touch something tamei, this is our main pasuk about the korban levi yored, O b'nivlat chayat me'ah, O b'nivlat be'mat me'ah, O b'nivlat sheretz tamei, now came Rabbi Eliezer and he said, it said all these things, but then in the end, the ne'elam was right next to the sheretz. So he says, "Hasheretz b'ne'elam mimenu, al helim sheretz chayav ve'enu chayav al helim mikdash." You're chayav on helim of a sheretz, not knowing that the sheretz, that you were tamei sheretz, but you're not chayav if you forgot this was the mikdash. And then Rabbi Akiva said, "V'ne'elam mimenu v'hu tamei." He darshans the end of that pasuk. The ne'elam not as close to the sheretz. He says the ne'elam is next to the word tamei. From there, you learn the helim tuma, you're chayav, you're not chayav, and helim mikdash. Now, it's unclear how these two differ, because in the end, they're both saying there's no helim mikdash, but Rabbi Eliezer says there is helim sheretz, and we don't know what that means. So the Gemara is going to figure that out right now. My benai, what's the difference between them? Chizki amal, sheretz nevela, sheretz unevela ika benai. What does that mean? Rabbi Eliezer savar bi'inan ad de yada iba sheretz itami iba nevela itami. You not just need to know that you were tamei. You need to know, was I tamei from a sheretz or was I tamei from an animal? You need to know what made you tamei. If you didn't know what made you tamei, there's no korban levi yored. The Rabbi Akiva savar lo b'inan ad yeda. Kevin diyadidi tamei ba'olam lo tzarichi b'sheretz itami ibn nevela itami. Because it doesn't have this drasha of the sheretz, it doesn't matter what way. Right? What Rabbi Eliezer is saying is basically why it's saying the pasuk or behema or chaya or sheretz. It's to teach you. You need to know what made you tamei. If you don't know what made you tamei, you're not going to bring this korban levi yored. Again, you had to know, forget, and then know again. And there's actually a debate among the Rishonim which knowledge had to be that you need. The knowledge in the beginning, you had to know there was a sheretz, and the knowledge at the end. I'm not going to go there, but there's a big machloket about that too. And Ula, by the way, said the exact same thing, that's the machloka between them, right? According to Rabbi Akiva, you just have to know you were tamei. We don't care by what. How does Ula also say that? Do Ula Rami do Rabbi Eliezer at Rabbi Eliezer? Umashan. He brings this contradiction between Rabbi Eliezer, what he said by us, and what he said somewhere else, and he explained. Did he really say that? Is that what you think he said? It contradicts the following source. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, manafshach. No Torah chaya. No Torah chaya. Shabbat chilel chayav. Yom Kippurim chilel chayav. He brings 6 examples. Each 2 are like the same category. You don't know if you ate chelev or you don't know if it was notar. Either which way, each one individually obligates you a chatat. So if you're not sure which one, you bring a chatat anyway. And when it comes to Shabbat or Yom Kippur, you're not sure which day you desecrated. Okay? Or you're not sure if you slept with your wife when she was a nidda or some other woman who was a rayot. That's a little bit of a weird one. Either which way, you're going to have to bring a chatat. That sounds more like Rabbi Akiva. You don't need to know exactly what you did wrong. So, Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, Hareyu omel, oh hodai lav chatato asher chata. Right? So Rabbi Yeshua says, but it says, you have to know the sin that you sinned. How could you possibly say not? Right? Ad shivadalo b'mechata. You have to know. Umeshane, and Rabbi Eliezer explained, hatam asher chata ve'evi, va'amar Rachmana chet koshu. Hacha michtiti b'chol davar tamei, o b'nevlat sheretz tamei lamali, shma mina b'inan adiyadi i b'sheretz itami i b'nevelita. So he says there, it says asher chata ve'evi. So there they say it doesn't matter. You just need to know that you sinned. That's by a regular korban chatat. But our korban ola v'yored is unique because it says, why? Basically, it says, why do you need sheretz, nevela, behema, all those things, sheretz, chaya, or behema in the pasuk? It must be telling you have to know which one. Okay? And that's how Ula resolved this contradiction. So Ula also must have thought the same thing as Chizkiah, that that's the debate between them. Because here you see it in what he said. Okay. Long daf, quick review. We started again. We did the first 3 sections were all having to do with this weird case. We said you're chayav shtayim. Remember, there's 2 obligations. We had to figure out when could you be obligated korban on the knisa and the prisha. Then Rava brought a mishnah to support each one. Rav Ada didn't agree with him that the second mishnah nidda had to do with what he thought, but Rava held his own. Then we had this machloket Abaye and Rava about about sexual relations while the man is not erect. Is that actually a problem or not? Is it just the lesser of 2 evils? And here we're just going to exempt you because you're honest. But in an arayo case, you be chayav. According to Rava, no, it's not even a maaseh avela. It's not even an action at all that's wrong. Then we started going through all the sources for the things that we discussed today, both the source for the mitzvah aseh and the lo taseh related to that. We talked about the prishalik prataveset, where the rabbis have some sort of source for it in the Torah, even though it's not a doraita. And then we had all these statements about if you do this or don't do this, what will happen to you? What will happen to your children? What are the effects of all these things? And a lot of it was smichut parshiot. And then we finished off with this machlok of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva and what the point of contention was between them. And with that, we finished for today, wishing everyone a good day, and we should have B'Sal Tovot.